Alrighty. Okay. I'm gonna get started here. Ooh, that looks very official. Okay. So, like I said last time, for last week, I had kind of an activity planned and I didn't get to it. So today we're gonna start with something a little different than just me lecturing, for the start of the class. We're actually gonna, have you do a little bit of thinking here. So there's no participation grade in the course, but it is hopefully something that'll be interesting. And I'll tell you a couple things really quickly, just the genesis of kind of what I am thinking here, and then I will give you. Actually, while I'm doing that, why don't I hand these out? If you could take one of these and just pass them along, and this will tell you which group you're in. They all have numbers on them. Okay, so. Basically, I had an activity and it will be changed now. So if you go into the folder for week 2, and I did this like a minute and a half ago, there's now a PowerPoint and a PDF called week 2 group activity. So if you can go and download that, the slides will be here and it'll be very similar. I changed it from what I was thinking last week because over the weekend I was reading the new book from Jean Twenge, which is called Generations. And I was like, oh, okay, I need to rethink this activity because I'm like, there's something else going on here that's really interesting. So if you had the slides from last week where I had the activity in there, I've now changed it. So go ahead and download the group, week 2 group activity slides from the folder. Okay, so basically what you're going to do and kind of what I want you to have a look at is, for each number, right? Basically, if I go one slide forward here, I've got a generation, right? So if you're in 1 or 6, you're going to do silent generation, and you'll gather in groups together, and you can do this as kind of a group activity. 1 and 6, you'll do the silent generation. 2 and 7, boomers. 3 and 8, Gen X. 4 and 9, millennials, and 5 and 10 would be Gen Z. Okay, so basically, I have a short list of questions. I shortened it from last week. Basically, just trying to think through like what's their life like, and especially, what are their kind of social conditions like? What does their day look like? How long do they go to school in terms of years, right? So how many years would they have spent in school? The life expectancy, when did they get married, or when do we expect them to get married? In the case of Gen Z, how many children we expect them to have, and a really big focus, and this is where kind of Twenge's book is tweaking my brain a little bit, and I'm only like 3 chapters in, but already I'm like, oh yeah, I see her point. It's really interesting. She tends to think of generational cohorts and their lives and the differences in their attitudes as being influenced by technologies, right? So she's a bit of a tech determinist. We'll forgive her for that, and I support her in this. We want to think through, especially so maybe spend a little bit more time on these last 2 points. What new technologies arrived that might have changed their lives, right, compared to their parents, and how, if at all, did technology change their lives compared to previous generations, right? So how did new technologies contribute to a different way of seeing the world, change the amount of information they had access to, change the kind of information they had access to, and all of these sorts of things. So yes, I want us to kind of think through, technological change along with generational change, because mostly, especially as they were young, right? These were generations that were impacted by new technologies, really changing the world. And I think you'll find lots of interesting stuff to talk about here, and I will kind of circulate through. The groups. Okay, and so once we've done that, we'll spend maybe half hour on that, and we'll debrief. We'll debrief, and so make sure in your group you have at least one person who's taking notes and is willing to, speak up and just tell me what you kind of found and what you were thinking. And then, we'll kind of we'll kind of go from there. We'll pick this up. We'll finish up talking about the history of youth and childhood, and then we'll start talking about families. And I don't. We'll have time for. Is it families the next one? I can't remember. It's either families or education, but we'll get through both of those in turn this week. Okay, so why don't we? We'll start with that. Okay, so I've got a whole bunch of groups here. So probably the easiest way is if, I don't know, ones are up kind of at the front here, twos, then threes, 4 in the middle, 5, 6, you know what, you can count. You'll find each other. I trust you to find each other, so use your number to find your, start with ones down at this corner and kind of spread yourselves out like that. And, have a look and try to do some research, and let's see, especially what technology might have done to these different generations of people. I'm gonna kind of float around here for a couple of minutes after I run out for 1 sec. All right. Extra papers. How many people are not here? Too many. Nope, too dark. Good. Okay. All right. I think everybody's more or less back, or people will wander in as they go get their water or whatever. Okay. So thanks for doing all of that. I think it's really interesting, and I think thinking about the way that, especially I think technology, because the longer I teach this class, for me it really started about a class on technology, and the longer I teach it, the more the focus of it is really on technology in all sorts of ways, and the ways that technology has changed the lives of young people, right? Has transformed the world from the world of the silence, right, where it was pretty in-person, pretty, community-oriented and all of these sorts of things, to the world of the millennials and Gen Z, where everything is online, interconnected, moving fast, more stress, more depression, and all of this kind of complicated stuff. And it's changed relationships. It's changed how people get into relationships, how early they form relationships, when they have children. All this stuff has been really fundamentally altered. So the lives of kind of these different generations, shaped by the technologies that were major when they were, especially when they were young, right? It's when you're young that these influences really kind of transform culture. Okay, so I'm going to pick up now, from that fun activity. It'll feel a little disjointed. We're going to jump into, back into where we were at the end of last class. We were talking about some kind of, so we were talking, really kind of generational, history of youth and childhood. And we got to, I think, the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, how the Quebecois experience was different from the rest of Canada up to the kind of baby boomers. Okay, so from there, we're going to look at a couple other kind of minority experiences, particularly, in the U.S., the experience of African Americans, particularly in the 50s and 60s, and then, some of the ways that Indigenous people's experiences were a bit different as well in Canada. And then we'll jump into talking about families and socialization. Next class, we'll start off, because, already we're careening towards the first kind of midterm. So next class, I'll start with kind of looking at some example questions, and then we should finish families and education pretty easily in the time that we have. Alrighty. Oops, I'll skip ahead now. Okay, so we ended off, I think, on this slide, and just noting that, one of the big differences, especially when we start talking about, millennials and Gen Z, is millennials and Gen Z essentially now are living in a very different kind of cultural climate that the boomers, the silence the boomers and Gen X were living in, especially when it comes to kind of the ethnic and racial makeups of society, right? From the 1960s really till the present, increased racial diversity across the West, especially Canada and the US, less so in the UK, but still happening kind of slowly and steadily in the UK. But we're seeing more and more kind of diversity, in Canada, big chunks of the population coming from Southeast Asia, East Asia, the Caribbean, North Africa, and the Middle East, and increasingly sub-Saharan Africa. And this is slated to continue, right, where, by basically at latest the middle part of this century, there will be no clear majority population in any of these countries, whereas, white people are the majority in Canada, the US. By 2040, and by 2050 at the latest, right, they'll be the largest minority, but a minority nonetheless. And for millennials and Gen Z, these boundaries matter less. They've grown up with lots of people of different races and cultures. Intermarriage between racial groups and ethnic groups is much more common than it was in the past. And religious groups, a lot of the boundaries that used to exist for millennial or for boomers, Gen X, have really broken down for millennials and Gen Z. And again, especially for millennials, and then increasingly even more for Gen Z, it's no big deal. That's just normal for them. Okay, when we talk about both for kind of African Americans or black people in the Americas in particular, and indigenous people, we're still dealing in a lot of ways with, the legacy of colonialism, right? Basically, the conquest of, much of the New World, or all of the New World by the major European powers, and then the subsequent, historical events that kind of came in. So the oppression of indigenous people, transatlantic slave trade, slavery in the U.S., less so in Canada, though it's still here. And all of these things continue to have, a marked impact on, and I mean, if you go to Latin America, right, the domination by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and the kind of subjugation of the indigenous people of South and Central America as well. All of which still have, huge effects, still dominated by European populations that in some, respects have spent, a couple of centuries at least committed to projects of assimilating, indigenous people, and, increasingly, from kind of the later part of the 19th century with African Americans, figuring out what to do with this population that was now no longer slaves, but basically people didn't want to consider equal either. Okay. All right. So why, slavery in the Americas? I think we're all pretty familiar with the history. Basically, slavery of Africans starts more or less the moment European exploration kind of begins. So by the 1450s, right, the Spanish in particular have reached places, islands just north of Africa called the Canary Islands, and taken slaves out of that population. And when, the Europeans journey to the New World, or, the Caribbean to start with, and then South Central and North America, they bring slavery with them, right? So you have, huge numbers of African peoples who are brought to North America and South America and the Caribbean, basically as agricultural workers. There's lots of reasons for this. It's less expensive, obviously, than paying people, but Europeans also struggle with tropical diseases, especially in the Caribbean, the southern part of the U.S., and Latin America. So the big one being malaria, right? Europeans are particularly vulnerable to malaria. Africa, Africans are less vulnerable to it because, they've been living with it for millennia, right? Malaria is just part of the natural kind of disease and pathogen kind of environment in Africa. So Africans were less likely to die of malaria working, south of what's today called the Mason-Dixon line. Slaves from Africa proved particularly hardy and cheap in terms of labor, and so they were imported, in massive numbers. Obviously, this basically by the 19th, so basically from 1492, the end of the 15th century, till really the beginning of the 19th century, slavery is considered entirely unproblematic, and large numbers of slaves are moved into, the Americas. And it really isn't until the beginning of the 19th century that people start to consider this a problem. And one of the kind of, though it had been bubbling up, towards the end of the 18th century, there's a real push at the beginning of the 19th century in England against slavery, and particularly a bunch of people who end up in Parliament led by a guy named William Wilberforce, basically push back against the slave trade, and they actually managed to get it outlawed in 1807. To kind of retroactively, basically it's like, well, you can't sell or buy any new slaves as of 1807 in any British controlled territory, and the Royal Navy starts running ships against the slave trade in the North Atlantic. Slavery is mostly abolished completely by 1833. Basically, they say, well, this is dumb. And Wilberforce and his allies continue to push against slavery and say, okay, we can't just abolish new slavery, we have to abolish existing slavery. So essentially slavery ends in any British overseas territories and in the UK in 1833. Remains legal in the US, for another basically 3 decades until the end of the Civil War in 1865, right? So the American Civil War is essentially fought over the southern states' right to have slavery, which the northerners want abolished for similar reasons as the British did. Really, it's driven by their sort of Christian convictions that everybody is human, right? Everybody's made in the imago Dei. And so they're like, well, we can't have slaves. It just takes that long to kind of trickle down into the US South. And really, they have to fight a war to finally get rid of it because it's such a backbone of the Southern economy. But the North does win and slavery ends. But following the end, right, it's not like things get great for African Americans or Black people in the United States. They continue essentially to be oppressed, right? Racism persists, even in places where there were large numbers of African Americans, and they were able to form kind of strong voting blocks. You know, there are some points in which, you know, in the late 19th and early 20th century, you know, congressmen who are Black start to be elected, and there's a real fear by the white population in these places that Black people are going to take over and, you know, whatever. I can't even remember what they were afraid of, but they were afraid of it nonetheless. So they pass a bunch of laws that restrict and segregate African Americans in the U.S. South, right? So it essentially keeps African Americans pretty poor, pretty kind of oppressed, and with unequal access to institutional life in the U.S. There's a doctrine that's sort of passed. I think is it Dred Scott? I think it's Dred Scott. I can't remember the exact Supreme Court ruling that basically, you know, the idea of, you know, that the U.S. in the South had set up kind of separate institutions for whites and Blacks, and that you could be separate but equal, is challenged a few times in the Supreme Court, and it's basically upheld by the Supreme Court. It's like, no, separate but equal works, and it basically will stay that way until the 1950s. So, you know, Black people have to set up their own parallel institutions. You still have, you know, in the US, historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, where basically, because they weren't allowed access to white colleges, they had to set up their own institutions. And this is the sort of normal life for African Americans, basically from the end of the Civil War until the 1950s. Yeah, and I mean, almost exclusively, like right up until the middle part of the 20th century, the post-war period, most African Americans lived in the South, the southern part of the United States. You know, even though we think of cities like Baltimore, which is kind of in the South and kind of not, or Detroit, Michigan, as having large African American minorities today, that's actually a relatively recent phenomenon. Even New York, it's a relatively recent phenomenon because most people stayed kind of in the South, you know, where their families had been since the time of slavery. And this was, you know, a profoundly unequal place where everything was segregated, right? Very famously, like the Pentagon, you know, the government building, which is in Virginia, has double the number of bathrooms it actually needs for the staff that work there because there were separate bathrooms for whites and Blacks. Okay, so, you know, Plessy Ferguson, not Dred Scott upheld slavery. Plessy v. Ferguson. Sorry. Yeah, the principle that segregation didn't violate the Equal Protection Act clause of the 14th Amendment was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1896 in Plessy v. Ferguson. And basically, it was only later overturned in 1954 when Plessy was struck down in a case called Brown versus Board of Education. Okay, so Brown versus Board of Education was a big moment and, you know, gets us back to this kind of question of youth. Brown versus Board of Education was all about access to schools, right? And basically, the plaintiffs in Brown were these 9 African-American students who wanted to attend a segregated white high school, right? And they basically, you know, challenged segregation in Montgomery, Alabama. Basically, they challenged segregation, the segregation laws at the state level, and then, you know, to the federal level, and finally up to the Supreme Court level, where finally segregation and this idea of separate but equal being constitutional under U.S. law was struck down, right? So these 9 students, you know, I think they called them the Montgomery 9. Basically, you know, they were allowed then to register at this all-white high school. They had to be basically escorted in by the National Guard right? There was so many protests around this school that as they were showing up for the first day, there were violent mobs there, and the U.S. Army essentially had to stand there and make sure these young people were able to attend this high school. Only 7 of them graduated. 2 of them eventually, dropped out and went to a different school because the harassment from fellow students was quite something as well. So this really starts, a pushback against segregation and against racist laws. And through the whole movement, young people, young African Americans, were really key to the movement and to pushing forward, anti-segregation and civil rights kind of laws. Often this was done kind of consciously. So obviously young people, often being kind of idealistic, wanted a better future for themselves, but they were all the leaders of the movement, and specifically Martin Luther King Jr. and his allies also put young people at the forefront. And they would do what could be considered, in a sense, publicity stunts, right? Where basically they would make sure that, the image coming forward was a lot of young people essentially being sent to prison by kind of racist cops in the South. There's a very famous incident where basically, these young African Americans had been barred from a dance hall. They wanted to attend a dance. And basically they showed up, a whole bunch of them at this dance hall and basically forced the police to haul them away one at a time, or as many as they could fit in the paddy wagon, until a cell that basically, or a prison at the local police station that held 50 had almost 500 people kind of stuffed into it. And again, this is like a publicity stunt, young people pointing out how absurd these laws were that they would arrest, young people for just wanting to go to a dance. They were also, often in the front lines of protests, and the image here, which actually it doesn't look too bad, is a very famous Associated Press picture that ran basically in every major newspaper in the U.S. This is a protest, in the South. I want to say it's again in Montgomery, Alabama, where basically, young African Americans were protesting segregation laws and these different kinds of injustices they were facing. And this one young man basically kind of walked towards this policeman with a dog, and the dog kind of jumps at him, and the photographer captures it. Now, as it turns out, this was done quite intentionally, right? It looks like this kid is just being attacked by a dog, but the young person actually sort of provoked it. But the picture itself, of a, just a kind of school-aged, black student getting attacked by a police dog ended up on the front page of essentially every newspaper in the United States. And it was, used to polarize public opinion, especially in the North. The North of the U.S., was more populous at the time. It had more political power. It had more, congressmen in it. And so they basically King and his allies were conscious of the fact that you needed to polarize people in the North so they would support civil rights in the South, because they'd basically been kind of like, that's a Southern problem, we don't really care, since the end of the Civil War. And these images do exactly that, right? So photography, newspapers, the beginnings of television really bring these images into people's homes in the North and polarize public opinion so that in the North, they start to support things like the Civil Rights Act, which will be passed in 1966 by Lyndon B. Johnson. And so you get, kind of a decade of work from Brown v. Board of Education to kind of full civil rights for African Americans. And through this whole time, young African Americans are at the forefront of the movement. And you see this again, right, with things like Black Lives Matter, right? Very much a youth-driven movement in lots of ways. Young people taking the forefront in terms of dealing with, the racist institutions of the South. Okay. That's an interesting question. When the slave trade was banned in 1807 for new slaves, did the price of existing slaves go up? Technically in the overseas, like in the British Empire, right? The ban on slavery meant you could neither purchase nor transfer slaves, right? So you couldn't get a new slave and you couldn't sell your existing slave to anyone else. Basically, you had to hold the slave until they passed away, right? At which point you would be no longer able to replace them. That would have included, again, in the UK or in Britain proper, there weren't a ton of slaves, but places like the British Caribbean, right? Which were places like Jamaica, and Barbados, where they grew sugarcane, would have been where you had the most slavery in kind of the British Empire, and then a few other places. But yeah, you wouldn't have been able to purchase any new slaves or transfer any slaves in the British Empire. As to what it did in the U.S., especially as the Royal Navy basically patrolled the African coast and basically captured slave ships. I actually don't know if that raised the price of slaves in the U.S. That is an interesting question. I will see if I can find the answer to that. I would assume probably. Yes, okay, I can do that. But okay, I'll finish answering this question. Yeah, basically, yeah, it might have, but I don't know. I'll see if I can find the answer. Can I re-explain how the Quiet Revolution relates to the topic of youth? All right, so particularly young Quebecers, right? They abandon the church, right? Church attendance goes down significantly, especially amongst the young. And particularly what they replace it with is a form of Quebec nationalism, right? So Quebec nationalism, as it bubbles through, especially in the 70s, and then all the way into the 80s, and then kind of finally more or less dying out at the beginning of the 1990s, is in a lot of ways a youth-driven movement, especially at the beginning, as people detach from... So their lives become very different, right? They get more educated. They go to school longer. They move to cities. They stop having large families for the most part. They stop being religious in major ways, right? Quebec goes from probably the most religious part of a religiously affiliated part of North America to the least, within the span of less than a decade. So they abandon religion in major numbers. Other things like cohabitation rates climb, marriage rates fall pretty precipitously, family size declines, and yeah, they basically become fervently nationalistic about Quebec, right? And French language and culture or Quebecois language and culture in particular. So it is something that appeals to young people, and particularly, they're concerned with the fact that they're being left behind by the rest of Canada, and their lives, if things continue, are going to look like undereducated with a lot of children and high rates of poverty, all of which essentially reverses in Quebec, and essentially carves out a very distinct kind of Quebecois society that has, amongst other things, really high taxes, really strong social services, and still a really strong kind of nationalism that goes through. I hope does that answer your question? If you can give me a thumbs up or a yes, that'd be great. I'll do a little dance while I wait. Nothing. They're doing this from home. All right. Now you don't want to say, okay, yes, great, perfect. Someone else said that because they just wanted me to move on. Okay. Good questions though. The slave question is an interesting one. I don't think I'd ever considered whether that increased the price of existing slaves. I'd always focused on the abolition as being important. Interesting though. Okay, so obviously, for Indigenous young people, again, this is, the prosperity of, we talk about Canada, it's true in the US as well. The prosperity of kind of Anglophone society in Canada and the US is not something that ultimately translated very well to Indigenous people. And really through, the 20th century, there was a pretty concerted effort by the Canadian government. So as one historian put it, the Canadian history, really from 1867 till today, consists of three major themes. Keep the French in, keep the Americans out, and make Indigenous people disappear. Right, to get rid of the problem as it was seen by kind of the Canadian government. And so kind of the history of young Indigenous people broadly has been marked by this same sort of pattern of essentially trying to get Indigenous culture, language, and peoples to disappear. And it's been pretty consistent, right? Obviously the most, I guess, I don't want to say visible, but the most known, the most known, especially given recent events in Canada, is the residential schools kind of movement, right? Which basically ran between 1876 with the passage of the Indian Act and 1997 when the last Indian residential school was closed. Principally, so these are government schools, right? Basically funded by the Canadian federal government. And for a large part of their history, more or less until about the 1970s, run by religious institutions, the largest being the Roman Catholic Church, and obviously, this past summer, Pope Francis came to Canada and specifically like Alberta, and went down to Massachusetts which I have trouble saying. Sorry. Oh, I thought I heard someone say something. And apologize for the Catholic Church's role in Indigenous residential schools, also run by the Anglican Church, the Lutheran Church, and the United Church, the three next biggest churches in Canada up to that point, essentially. Basically, these schools were designed to essentially turn Indigenous children into good British or Canadian subjects by, teaching them English, Christianizing them when that was still kind of a goal of the federal government, right? Christianizing them, so getting rid of Indigenous religious practices, which went along with the federal government banning Indigenous religious practices like the potlatch and the Sundance, which happened in the Indian Act of 1876. Getting rid of Indigenous religious practices, trying to suppress Indigenous languages by forcing them to speak either French or English in residential schools. And basically, meant that a good percentage, right, somewhere between a third and half of Indigenous young people spend many, many years in these kinds of institutions and away from home. Conditions were often abusive. The schools were chronically underfunded. The federal government, chronically underfunded the school. Disease was pretty prevalent, tuberculosis in particular, but other diseases as well. And so a not insignificant percentage of young people who went to these schools actually passed away. So, disease, neglect, or abuse, right, were all causes. And sexual abuse is also alleged in large percentages, which isn't surprising necessarily when you leave, children with minimal kind of adult supervision, right? Adults who would want to do so find it easy to abuse in such circumstances. Okay, I've got this little video to give myself half a second to take a breath. The one thing I will be critical about this, and I show you this video. This is from the government of Ontario. One of the things that both the religious institutions, especially the Catholic Church and the federal government, have spent the last several decades doing is pointing at each other as being the cause of the residential schools. So the church will point at the state and say, well, you were funding it, and the government will say, well, you were running it. This particular video from the government of Ontario, you would never know that the government had anything to do with residential schools. So, take it with a grain of salt. But they were government schools run by religious institutions. So both sides, have their blame. I don't know if I have volume.
Wanted to go back home. It was 1,000 kilometers away.
I do not have volume.
To go to the Indian residential school.
Oh, give me 1 second here. That's because I turned my audio off earlier for some reason. There we go. Hang on, let's try that again. Much better.
Johnny wanted to go back home. It was 1,000 kilometers away. They forced him to go to the Indian residential school. More than 150,000 of us children had to go. They wanted to change us.
Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name.
Hallowed be your name.
Thy kingdom come,
Thy kingdom come,
thy will be done.
Thy will be done.
Kill the Indian and the child. It's been called cultural genocide. I survived residential school. My brother Johnny did not.
Chani Wenjack was one of thousands of children who died due to Canada's residential school system. More than 80,000 survivors and their families still live with its legacy today.
Like I said, you'd never know the governments of Canada or Ontario had anything to do with residential schools from that video, which is always super fun. When we were talking about, kind of some of the philosophies about children that have predominated in kind of Western thinking, one of them we mentioned was obviously Locke's idea of the tabula rasa. And here's where, and I said this idea of the blank slate can kind of be good or bad. This is one of those instances where I think it's bad, right? there's kind of this presupposed assumption, right, that basically culture was all socialization, right, and that basically, children were a blank slate. And so the residential schools, in a lot of ways, are an attempt to get and be the ones to write on that blank slate when parents wouldn't have been able to, right? So essentially, right, it's, if you want to make sure that Indigenous languages and cultures kind of die out, you get to that blank slate first, and you kind of go from there. And that's essentially what happened, right? The aim of the residential schools was assimilation, cultural genocide, but not like, the goal wasn't to actually kill Indigenous children. It was to get rid of Indigenous culture, right? And basically integrate them into white British or French Canadian, if you're in Quebec, society, right? Basically get rid of that culture, kill the Indian in the child was, I think it was John A. Macdonald that kind of phrased it that way, though I don't recall who's the progenitor of that awful phrase. Because they were seen as unformed, they could still be molded into Canadian or British citizens if you got them away from their parents, and then their parents wouldn't have the chance to write those sort of, Indigenous beliefs, values, and communities onto that blank slate. And so that was the kind of goal. And so you can see where this kind of, complete vision of people as a blank slate it can go desperately wrong as well. And this is the last slide of this presentation, I think. Indigenous languages in Canada have all but disappeared, right? There's active efforts now, some of them at U of A, which is great, to actually revive them. But they're Indigenous languages all over the world are in a lot of trouble, in Canada particularly so. We obviously know now a lot of the legacy of physical and sexual abuse, in both for the people who survive residential schools, but also, multi-generational kind of traumas that they've passed on to other generations. Separation from culture, we now understand to be a much bigger kind of thing, because it separates you from identity and who you are and a connection to the past. And I don't know that we appreciated that before. I don't know that, kind of Canadians would have cared so much, but it's definitely something we're aware of now. Okay, do I have a question slide? I do have a question slide. So if you have any questions, we'll jump into families in a sec. We took a while on that first activity, which was great. So I want to jump in as quickly as possible, but we could take maybe like a 10-minute break today and come back at 2:55. Give everyone a chance to get some water and go to the bathroom if you need to. So why don't we come back in about 10 minutes at 2:55, and we'll jump in and we'll start in on families, and we should be easily able to get through all the material I want to by the end of next class. Okay, so 10 minutes. Come on back. We'll see you in a couple of minutes, and it'll be great. Okay.
I think on the first day, some offhandly asked if you did 24-hour final.
Yeah, I'll just.
Actually, 24-hour final?
So you'll still have like 2 hours to write it, but it'll be accessible to you for that whole 24-hour period, right? So you could write it anytime from midnight all the way to 11:59, right? So it's open. You have to be done at 11:59, and once you start, it starts the clock, right? Yeah. So then you have 2 hours to complete. So.
Oh, okay, and so it won't be due by June 16, 8 a.m. Like that 8 a.m. is not going to be the due date.
No.
Oh, okay. So I wanted to make sure because I have a final the day before, so I was trying to figure out what I'm going to write.
Yeah. So you can write it anytime that day, right? So if you want to start it at 10 o'clock. As long as you're done by midnight, you're all good.
Oh, okay. So it's like midnight of June 16th.
Yeah.
I have the entire day of June 16th.
Yeah.
Right? Just
Yeah.
2 hours.
Once you start.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Okay. Discord. Okay. I need to be. My back hurts. Oops, those were from last semester. I think. Sword. Pardon me. Voila. Alrighty, let's let's jump back in here. Go for another little bit, and then we'll break for the day. Alrighty, okay, so we're done with kind of histories. So hopefully we have a sense now of kind of where this concept of youth and childhood comes from, and how it's changed over time, right? How we went from really having no concept of what a young person, like youth and childhood were, to having this incredibly elongated period, right, where now youth kind of stretches into your mid to late 20s. So we're going to kind of delve in here now, kind of the course sort of goes topical from here, where we sort of start, we'll talk about families, we'll talk about education prior to the midterm, which is not next class, but the class, like, I guess it's a week from Wednesday, because we have the long weekend coming up and there's no class next Monday. Okay, so yeah, we'll jump into talking about, excuse me, Gosh. Families here and socialization and really the role that family plays in shaping people. Now, family is probably, aside from generational cohort, the most significant influence on people's values, on people's kind of trajectories through the rest of their life course, right? If you come from a well-off family, you're likely to remain well-off for the most part. So families play an enormous role. Beliefs about kind of religion, about gender roles, about all of these things are shaped really strongly in the family context. Again, generational cohort plays a big role as well, right? Your peers and the media environment, all that play a big role in shaping all of those things also. But, much of it is shaped by family. Okay, so family structure. So, especially as it relates to young people, the kind of families they live in have changed significantly from the 1950s, right? So really, like if we go back to the Middle Ages, which we must, it was pretty common for people to live in kind of multi-generational family units, right? That were vertically integrated, that would have included, grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, all of those living in relatively close proximity, right? Probably on the same plot of land that the family had occupied for centuries, right? Once we get into industrialization and people move into the cities, people start getting, apartments, and especially, as people get more and more affluent through the 19th and into the 20th centuries, we move into a family structure that's much more typical of what we have today, what's referred to as the nuclear family, right? So the nuclear family basically being this kind of atomized version of the family where you have, two adult parents, most typically, like in the vast majority of cases, mom and dad, male and female partners, typically married, with biologically related children that live with them. Now again, there's obviously always been variations in this, where one parent dies and the other parent remarries, and families kind of get blended in that way. But that the nuclear family, two parents and their biologically related children being the most typical kind of family form. Now, for the most part, really up until the 1960s a little bit, and then into the 1980s, the norm was that, this was, these people were married, right? So they were married and they would remain married essentially through their whole lives, through thick and thin, except in very, very rare circumstances where separation or divorce might have occurred. But, kind of starting in the 1950s and 60s, things undergo massive changes. And by the, basically by the 2000s, the family kind of landscape is kind of unrecognizable. It would be something kind of completely different from what we would have seen in the 1950s. For this reason, sometimes people refer to the 1950s as the golden age of marriage, right? Where things were pretty good. People were living longer, staying married, getting married young, staying married, for very long periods of time, and having, relatively large families. There was also, a kind of, obviously prior to, the invention of contraception, if you have sex, you're getting pregnant, if you're female, obviously. And so, basically women didn't have necessarily the leisure to work outside of the home a lot of the time. They would have had, young children, basically from the time they got married, probably in their early to mid 20s, basically probably through until, their 40s. So it's cutting out a big part of their working lives. Now, that starts to change, obviously, with the introduction of birth control. The birth control pill kind of revolutionizes a lot of things, and it makes a lot of things much more possible. For one, women are much more able, once birth control is available and relatively reliable, to, plan when they want to have children, terminate, kind of their childbearing, I guess from a biological perspective prematurely, and pursue careers which give them a lot more job prospects and a lot less dependency on, their male partner for their kind of economic well-being. Yeah, so basically, whereas if you looked at like 1950 or the 1950s, about 80% of families would have been the nuclear family kind of model. By 2006, right? Only 34% of families were legally married with children. 15% were common law, 15% were single parents. And you had, a relatively large percentage and growing percentage of blended families, either simple blended families or simple step families or complex step families. Simple step families being like one person had children and then married someone else who didn't. Complex step families where both people bring children into the relationship, and those got more and more common. Generally related to women having more economic potential, and it's somewhere between, depending on which kind of period of time you're looking at, somewhere between 75 and 90% of divorces are initiated by women. So women are much more likely to leave relationships that they're in. So being able to support yourself afterwards is a big deal. And also, the kind of the coming of no-fault divorce laws. Originally, so prior to 1968, divorce in kind of any Anglo-American country is really difficult. So Canada specifically is 1968, but they're all kind of around the same time. Divorce was really difficult prior to 1968. Basically, you had to prove, abuse or active kind of adultery, right? So some sleeping with someone else, right? And you had to, basically have the receipts. You had to have more or less an admission by the other person that they were, sleeping around in order to get a divorce. Or you could, on really, really severe cases of abuse or abandonment, it was possible, right? Where, you could say, like, I've got 10 years of receipts of my bank statement showing that, this partner left and has never paid me a cent of child support or supported me economically in any way, then you could basically divorce them. 1968 makes this the Divorce Act makes this much more, much simpler, right? So physical or mental cruelty, still really difficult to prove, or following a period of 3 years of separation. So basically, it still requires cause, right? Or fault in one party, which is amended in 1985, and they bring in what's called no-fault divorce. And basically, under a kind of regime of no-fault divorce, after 1 year of separation, either party, so basically all you have to do is prove that you were living somewhere else for 1 year. So just have to have like bills with your new address on it, or someone testifying that you were, separated from your partner. And then you can file for divorce after that 1 year period without, either party having to be at fault. So right, in the absurd cases, you get celebrities who get married and 3 days later they file for divorce because of irreconcilable differences. Technically, this is no fault divorce. And then they still have to typically wait like 1 year for the divorce to go through, but that's typically how it goes. Okay. Divorce and remarriage, especially in the 1980s, there was a lot of fear about the impact of divorce and remarriage, especially on children. A lot of arguments were made that basically, it would wreck children, that it was breaking apart the family. Basically, this was going to be a kind of social disaster. The research on it, I would say, has been rather mixed, right? With some claiming that, it's had minimal impact, where, kind of more longitudinal studies, particularly looking at millennials, has suggested that in some senses, millennials' difficulties in forming long-term relationships may be the result of kind of the divorce culture that their parents propagated, right? And like, there's a lot in the middle. There's a lot of, people who say it really hurt children, and there's a lot of reason to think that that's true, but that, there's also kind of some social adaptability. So the research, I say, is very, very mixed. Now, in the 80s, it was all about, you're going to wreck the kids, you're going to, break apart families. It's going to be incredibly devastating for them, particularly driven by, I would say, more conservative forces, particularly the religious right in the US that had risen to prominence in the kind of late 1970s. Really pushed this idea that, the nuclear family being kept intact was ultimately the best, ultimately making kind of a functionalist argument that this was the best for everybody, for society, for children, and for married partners. Along with, I think, a somewhat healthy dose of misogyny, suggesting that, at fault for a lot of problems was women, deciding they wanted to re-enter the workforce. Yeah, like I said, it's the research is very mixed. In some cases, right, we've seen research suggesting that, children do well, especially if parents don't fight and if divorce is non-acrimonious, right? And they're able to stay in contact, especially daily, but very frequently with both parents. It's more devastating, what could I say? Like the older the child is, actually the worse divorce is, because they've had more time to get used to that family situation where both parents are there. It's harder on male children than it is on female children, typically, because their children are more likely to live with their mothers, which means that, boys in particular are separated from the same sex parent, which causes a lot more kind of problems. And, kind of that relatability issue in lots of cases. So, we could say tons about it. There's tons of research on divorce at this point. But like I said, for every, it's one of these fields, there's a lot of them, that for every study, suggesting that, kids do great, there's an equally valid and well-researched study saying that it's quite devastating for them, for their parents to get divorced. Okay, gay and lesbian parenting. So this is another kind of hot button kind of topic, especially kind of amongst millennials. It's a relatively recent phenomenon, right? Kind of the legitimization of same-sex kind of couples is relatively recent, right? Canada, 2005, same-sex marriage is made legal. Like I said, I think it's not till 2014 or 2015 in the US with Obergefell v. Hodges. And so it's a relatively recent phenomenon of having kind of, gay couples either having their own biological children or adopting children. So it's relatively recent. We don't have a ton of really, really great research. And there's, significant problems, I think, on kind of both sides of the equation, those saying it's wonderful and those saying it's terrible. Like one of the things that's been pointed out with a lot of studies, kind of early studies on same-sex parenting, they found that, actually children did really well, right? That the children of same-sex couples were either doing as well or even outperforming the children of kind of cisgender couples or heterosexual couples. And so, it was like, it's actually, it's broadly good, right? There's no major differences outside of some fear the children have about stigma. Now, these studies typically were not super huge sample sizes, and that's been one of the big problems, is same-sex parenting remains a really relatively small phenomenon. It's not the majority of same-sex couples that choose to have children. And obviously there's massive difficulties for same-sex couples wanting to have children, right, which often requires, reproductive technology, so artificial insemination, or, for gay couples in particular, using surrogates. So it's an incredibly expensive, they can adopt, but if they want their own biological children, it's often very expensive. And so, adoption's expensive as well. So it's been kind of the purview of particularly rich same-sex couples, which may account for, why they do so well, because wealth tends to insulate you against a lot of problems. So having parents that were rich enough to afford adoption or, reproductive technologies likely means that you're in a relatively upper middle class kind of scenario, which is going to have, all sorts of good kind of outcomes. The other one, and one of the problems with a lot of the early studies, is that they basically asked parents how they thought their children were doing, and parents more or less said, they're doing great, and so it wasn't as rigorous or as large sample size as you would have wanted. But generally, that's where the research has been, and I saw a report. Maybe about a month or two ago, which basically reaffirmed, it was what was it? They call it a kind of survey of the existing research that sort of backed up that finding. Now that said, there has been some, there always is contrarian points of view. One of the more famous ones in terms of, looking at the impact of, this was more having a parent who is gay or lesbian came from a researcher at UT Austin, or University of Texas, Austin, named Mark Regnerus, and we'll hear about him some more later because he's done some interesting work on sex and sex and dating apps and porn and all this sort of stuff that I find interesting. But Regnerus, basically published an article in June of 2012 in Social Science Research, so one of the biggest journals in the field, using data from a study that he ran out of UT Austin called the it's too small on my screen, New Family Structures Study, or NFSS. And basically the goal of the study was to look at how divorce parenting, blended families, and all these things affected children, and generally showed a negative effect on children having a gay or lesbian parent. Now, Regnerus kind of openly, if you read the article, says this is a very small sample of our overall sample. We had trouble finding, even in this huge national study, a lot of this kind of parenting style represented. It wasn't necessarily that they had been raised by gay or lesbian parents, but they had a parent who potentially came out as gay or lesbian after they were born. So he sort of openly admits this is an interesting kind of piece, but basically it requires a lot further study. Now, that said, it showed generally negative effects in all sorts of fields: self-esteem, educational attainment, economic attainment, into adulthood, of people who said they had a gay or lesbian parent. So, and mental health, all sorts of kind of negative outcomes generally. A huge outcry came out from particularly LGBT groups, but other scholars as well. The journal suspended the article, so they basically kind of put a pause on it, and they took it down from the journal page, which is really unprecedented because it had passed peer review. And basically, they sent it out for a second time for a second peer review, which is really unprecedented. I've only heard of it happening a couple of times. And basically, it passed the second peer review, saying look, he interpreted the data correctly. That's what the data says, and he's made the appropriate caveats. And yeah, so like I said, several problems with the study, which Mark Regnerus admits openly, compared children with intact biological families to those who had who had a parent with a same-sex sexual partner and a small sample size. But there's not a lot of data out on it. We're getting more now, and more and more rigorous kind of data, which tends to be still in that category, the top category. But we still see a kind of minority of kind of social science research pointing the other way, which again, I'll just say is always the case. You always end up with this kind of back and forth as people look at data, collect new data, and it's always a process of discovery. Okay. I should say that every time I change kind of topics, I change the Slido. So if you're typing it in the old one, I'm probably not going to see it. So you might want to retype. Any questions in this one? I'll come back to it in a sec. Okay. So how people parent plays a big role in kind of socio-emotional development for children in major ways, right? And we could talk about kind of, psychologists have identified more or less 4 major parenting styles that tend to predominate how people parent. And of course, they come with a confusing set of names, right? Because 2 of them sound almost exactly the same and people get them mixed up all the time. But they're authoritative, authoritarian, indulgent, permissive, and indifferent, negligent. Now, so what do these styles ultimately mean? I'm sure if you've taken a psychology class, you've probably heard all of these already. So authoritative, right? So this is the one that tends to be prized as the best parenting style, right? This is the one that if you were, to read a child rearing book, this is the kind of parenting that, whether it uses the term authoritative or not, they would be advocating for. Okay, so what do you have in terms of authoritative parenting? It is generally, high control, right? So there are a lot of rules. Authoritative parents have a lot of rules. They set very, very clear boundaries for children. Now, these boundaries aren't always fixed, right? It's kind of a sliding scale, and authoritative parents, as children get older, they give them more responsibilities, they allow them more freedom, but there's still a lot of rules and limits. And generally this is good, right? even adolescents, right, require limits. They require kind of knowing what's allowed and what's not allowed, what their parents are going to tolerate, what their parents aren't going to tolerate, and they tend to do worse, have more anxiety if rules are unclear or unevenly enforced. Okay, so it comes with a lot of rules, but it also comes with high warmth, right? So this tends to be close relationships that parents have with their children, right? They tend to give them a lot of affection, but also in terms of the rules themselves, there's also a lot of room for explanation. So parents who are authoritative explain the rules very clearly and why the rules are there. They often give children a chance for input, even if that input doesn't ultimately change the rule. It can modify it a little, or at least children are given a sense of agency in it. And there's also a ton of personal warmth, right? These are close and loving relationships that affirm children in major ways. Okay, so that's authoritative. And again, if you're, none of you probably have ventured here, but when you end up reading parenting books, if you end up reading parenting books one day, which sometimes is great and other times can make you feel like a damn fool. But if you end up reading parenting books one day, almost inevitably, this is the kind of parenting they're going to be advocating for, whether they use the term or not. Authoritarian parenting, right? So you think authoritarian, it's kind of like a dictator, right? Like Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, right? They're authoritarian, they're dictatorial, so kind of in that sort of style, right? So high control, like tons and tons and tons of rules, right? And the rules are very strict, but it's low warmth. So the rules are often not explained. They're just like, well, why? Well, because I said so. Okay, not a great explanation for a rule. Imaginary person I just made up. But they're often not explained, and often the emotional connection between parents and children is lacking, right? So there's a lot of rules, but not a lot of emotional warmth or connection. Now, and this can be for a bunch of different reasons. It does tend to have a sort of class, like socioeconomic class basis to it. But yeah, basically not as emotionally connected. All right, so indulgent and permissive, another style, or indulgent or permissive, basically is another style. Typically what you see with indulgent parents is that they're low control, right? So they don't have a lot of rules, or rules are sparsely enforced, right? But they have a lot of affection and warmth for their children. This I always think of as like the parent who's trying to be their kid's best friend. The problem with being your kid's best friend is it's hard to discipline your best friend, right? So at the end of the day, not a great parenting style. So very low control, right? Few rules, can cause a lot of anxiety in young people, but a lot of emotional warmth from the parents. And then the one that's really the easiest to understand, right? The indifferent or negligent, low control and low warmth, right? So few rules, children are often left to their own devices, often given very few boundaries, and also, poor emotional connection with parents. Now, there are kind of class markers here, right? So typically when we're talking about, like authoritative and indulgent, we see this more in the middle and upper classes, right? Not to say that they can't exist in other classes, but they're more typical of middle class and upper class parents. Why? Well, partially because it's easier to be high warmth when you have more time, right? When you're kind of socioeconomically secure, you have the support of a spouse or another parent. So you have lots of time to spend with children, right? You'll tend to get higher warmth relationships. Whereas when you get to, say, can I change my pen color? I probably shouldn't waste my time on this. Authoritarian and indifferent, these tend to be more typical of the working class and the poor. Partially, it's values and how they were raised, right? These things kind of get passed on generation to generation. So if you had a parent that was more in that authoritarian style, you're more likely to emulate that style at the end of the day. Also, there's working class parents and kind of poor parents are more likely to be struggling kind of economically and spending more time basically on just survival. So they're more likely to have less time for nurturing children, warm relationships. They're maybe working, I say a lot. They're working more often 2 or maybe 3 jobs, and they're sometimes leaving children in the care of either neighbors, older siblings, or other relatives, right? So those relationships aren't fostered in the same way. Now again, this isn't entirely true of everybody, right? This is just on average, right? You can be from a working class family and have a high warmth relationship with your parents. Nothing saying you can't. It's just like everything in sociology, it's all about kind of big social averages. 34% of families were legally married with children. I mean, married families with kids. So 34% of families, they're married. So they're married and their children live with them, right? So basically, they're married and their biological kids live with them. So it's your kind of traditional nuclear family. Sorry, should have been clearer on that sentence. Hopefully that answers it. Okay, forward. Oh, I have this. Sorry, I have to play this video. It's a beautiful video on parenting styles. You'll like it. It's quite funny. All right. Only 3 of them are here, but there you go. I stole it from YouTube.
Jeffrey, look at this mess. Clean this up right now.
But why?
Because I said so.
Okay.
Now pick it up. Oh my god, your dog is so cute.
Thanks. I'm hoping she doesn't poop everywhere like she did last time. That's weird. I'm sorry. How are you today?
I'm good.
Cool.
Okay, thanks.
Shit.
Jeffrey, it's time for dinner. Can you clean up this mess for me?
Go away! What's for dinner? Are we having pizza?
We weren't gonna have pizza.
Well, I want pizza, okay?
We can have pizza because you want to have pizza.
Okay, go away.
Okay. Bye, honey.
Okay.
Oh my goodness, I love your dog. She's adorable.
Oh yeah?
You know it's illegal to smoke here because of the forest fires, right?
Are you a cop?
No, but I thought maybe you might be more concerned about the environment.
Why don't you just walk on?
Okay. Jeffrey, it's time for dinner. Can you pick all this mess up for me, please, before dinner?
But why?
Well, Mommy has to pick up her messes when she makes them, too. It just makes everything better for the house.
Okay.
All right, thank you, sweetie. Oh my god, your dog is so cute. Where'd you get her?
I got her at a Pomeranian rescue.
Oh, that's really nice.
Yeah, well, I wanted a little pet project while my nonprofit was in off-season.
Oh, what do you do?
Well, we're trying to increase the literacy rates in war-torn countries.
That's really fascinating. Good for you.
Thank you.
Well, have a good day. My name is Ashley, by the way.
Jeffrey, very nice to meet you.
It's nice meeting you, Jeffrey.
Take care.
Okay. Oh, there's bloopers.
Jeffrey, look at this mess. You need to clean this up right now.
But why?
Because I said so. I feel like a Jewish mom.
Yes, you just you totally did. I've been in here slaving all day on the matzah.
Now pick it up. Shut your mouth. Oh, really? What do you do?
I actually donate embryos to African children.
Embryos to African children. Give me a break. Oh, that's really nice.
Yeah, I want a little pet product, but
I needed a pet product.
Okay. So, anyway, I like them. They're funny. And like I said, I stole it from YouTube. I don't even know if it's still there, but I have it forever and I'm never giving it up. Okay, so obvious statements are obvious. This is right from the textbook. A growing body of research linking good parenting with positive outcomes, in terms of adolescent development, including preventing involvement in antisocial behavior and general benefits of psychological development. Okay, so I mean, this is what all the research shows. And if you ever go take a criminology course, or if you take Youth, Crime, and Society, Social 321, one of the things that we see in like all of the models of how antisocial behavior develops in young people is it always starts with poor parenting, right? It almost always starts with either negligent parenting or authoritarian parenting, but particularly with inconsistent kind of rules or inconsistent enforcement, right? Where basically people don't have good rules, and especially if they don't form kind of pro-social bonds with adults, they're more likely to end up in kind of what we call deviant behavior, right? Typically, when you have good parenting, right, most outcomes are relatively good, right? When you have lots of supervision, you tend to have good outcome as well. And supervision is super important for young people's development because when they're unsupervised, they tend to do all sorts of crazy things. They tend to, things like kids who are unsupervised will tend to have sex much earlier, right? And regardless of what you think of that, generally speaking, from a psychological perspective, the later someone becomes sexually active, the better it is because they're more prepared kind of psychologically and emotionally for, what being sexually active means, right? Typically, if you're unsupervised, so this happens much more amongst the working class and amongst divorced parents who don't remarry, what you end up with is higher or younger ages where their children become sexually active, right? So again, kind of negative. So supervision is really important in general. Drug use, the other one, substance use. When people are unsupervised, young people are unsupervised, they tend to enter substance use at a much earlier age and do it much more frequently. So supervision is super important for good behavior. And the warmer their relationship is with their parents, the more able they are to form kind of pro-social bonds with other adults, teachers in particular, which will then help them, academically and do well. So not surprisingly, good parenting, that kind of not authoritarian, I always screw those up, sorry, excuse my mouth. Authoritative parenting tends to be the one that leads to those really, really good outcomes. Okay, and I already said this because sometimes I forget what's on the slides and I get excited and I tell you things that are on slides in the future, but parenting styles vary by social class, right? Working class parents tend more towards that authoritarian or negligent kind of parenting, where the middle class is more authoritative or permissive in its style. Okay. So, gender socialization, or where do young people learn, what it means to be kind of masculine or feminine, feminine? Sorry, I don't know what word that was. Feminine, masculine, feminine, male or female, what kind of social norms around, gender identity or gender roles typically comes, from family, right? This is where they're going to observe this in the kind of first case and where they're going to learn a lot of those lessons. Now, again, I will say that cohort, right, or generational cohort matters a lot because probably, people growing up who are millennials and Gen Z are going to have seen a lot more kind of working women, even if their own moms weren't working. So some of this, does play generational cohorts, but family is still an important site. And there's sort of three big schools of how gender socialization happens or how people come into gender roles. How gender is kind of constructed. One of them, comes from feminism, and I've kind of alluded to it already in the course, is that feminists have tended to take a strict social constructionist or socialization view of gender, right? Where basically the idea that comes from I would say second and third wave feminism, people like Andrea Dworkin, McRobbie, Catherine McRobbie, and all the people that follow them, is that there's really nothing inherent biologically that leads to particular gender roles, right? That basically, people are a blank slate. I think if you took the kind of base feminist view from kind of second wave feminism, is that, human beings, male and female, are a blank slate And that basically the reason that we end up in these kind of differentiated gender roles, right, where we think of certain traits as feminine, certain traits as masculine, and we have certain things that we expect men to do, certain things we expect women to do, is ultimately kind of constructed in society, right? Now feminists will tend to point to the patriarchy as being the construct that maintains the current kind of system that they say privileges men over women. But basically, what they'll suggest is that we're constantly, in a phrase you might see in some feminist texts, is that we're constantly doing gender, right? The gender is this kind of ongoing process of gendering and regendering that's happening all the time in kind of every interaction, and one that starts kind of incredibly young, right? So part of the process of socialization, and then it really starts essentially at, I was going to say birth, but increasingly now, right, with like gender reveal parties, it increasingly seems to happen, when someone accidentally sets off a blue explosion that takes out the power for half the neighborhood, or lights something on fire with blue flames or something equally ridiculous. But right, basically the second that you've, for kind of feminist discourses, the second that you've gendered someone, a child as male or female, the process of gendering begins, right? So as soon as you have, said that, it's a boy or a girl, you ultimately start this process, right? You buy pink things with unicorns on them for girls, and you buy kind of blue sleepers with tractors on them for boys, and you continue that in terms of practices of giving them certain toys to play with, right? Giving them certain activities to do, physically interacting with them in different ways, in play, right? Lots of studies have suggested that, people are more kind of physical with boys, with, young boys, baby boys, than they are with baby girls. Other things. There's been lots of studies suggesting that in terms of physical competencies, parents will tend to overestimate the physical competencies of their boys and underestimate the physical competencies of their girls. One famous experiment said that, basically set it up so that they had an inclined ramp. And they asked parents whether they thought that their baby could they had a series of inclined ramps, like, well, do you think your baby can scale this ramp? What about this one? What about this one? Like increasing kind of angles. And parents with male children tended to overestimate how well their infant would do, and with female children tended to underestimate. So they tended to think that girls were less physically able than boys. So there's research definitely kind of supporting this kind of feminist point of view. And they'll say, right, it kind of goes on through life, right? Where basically, you have different expectations of girls and boys. Different household chores will be given to girls and boys. Girls are more likely to be given those that are more typically domestic, right? House cleaning, care for younger siblings, these sorts of things. Whereas boys are more likely to be given, more physical tasks like mowing the lawn, taking out the trash, and these sorts of things. God, if I could get my children to take out the trash, I don't care which one of them did it. I would take any of them. But yeah, so boys granted more independence, particularly as they get older. They're given, they're less sheltered. Okay. Oh, I did have, I thought this was, okay, so this is a video kind of illustrating this from the BBC. It's not without its problems, most notably that the presenter is kind of smarmy and annoying, but I'll play it for you anyway. And it kind of illustrates this typically kind of feminist and gender studies kind of position on how we acquire gender, how gender is socialized.
Look at this. Look at this. Do you like a dolly? Should we go for a dolly? There's a good girl. You're a good little girl, aren't you, Sophie? Look, what does this say? Sweet dreams. Sweet dreams. Ooh, look at this meow. I think she liked that pink dolly the best.
If I were to tell you actually that Sophie is Edward,
Ah,
does that change anything?
I maybe thought, oh, this is a little girl, so I have to give her little girl things.
Solo. Solo. Hello. Hello. Come on.
What's this one? What's that one do? Is that a robot? What about this? You like that one? What does this one do? Oliver. Oliver.
You've gone for, you could say, boy toys for this boy.
Possibly in my subconscious, but for me, I was just going for what was around me, but then perhaps my subconscious was automatically playing a trick on me that I was...
If I tell you that he is actually a girl.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. I suppose it's because of the stereotype.
And then that changed your behaviour towards the child.
It did.
And your behaviour was
lie,
quite
it
directive.
Did. 1, 2, 3. Beep, 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 beep. Do you want to see my robot?
She's picked up the robot, the car, the puzzle game. And I think she's been much more physical in handling the child than the other adults have been with girls.
That really astounded me because I thought that I was somebody that had a really open mind.
Surprise. So I automatically went for the pink fluffy toy because I said it was a girl, so I was sort of stereotyping.
I've always thought I was rather more open-minded than that, and I would think, you know, these are children's toys, whatever the gender.
It will make me think the next time I'm with a child, so my niece or my nephew, to make sure that I am actually being sort of fair and equal with all of them, and just giving each child an opportunity to just be whoever they are.
Okay. So that's a pretty typical kind of feminist kind of reading of gender, right? That it's all socialization, that the reason that, you know, more men go into the STEM fields, like science, technology, engineering, math fields, than women do is because of the way they're socialized, or that develops the brain in particular ways. Now, there are, I think, considerable, like I said, there's considerable evidence that backs parts of this, but there's also considerable kind of evidence that might be taken against it. I mean, some of the most, I think, interesting research has looked at particularly egalitarian countries and the way that kind of social roles essentially distribute, right? So if we look at particularly the Scandinavian countries, you know, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Denmark, they're some of the most egalitarian countries in the world in terms of, you know, the ability of people to take on whatever role they want to take on, right? You know, in terms of social supports, you know, in terms of attitudes about gender equality, they rank the highest in the world. And one of the things that's kind of weird that happened is as these countries got more egalitarian in their thinking, right, and people were like, people can do whatever they want, it's actually sort of reified gender roles in lots of ways. So if you go to Sweden, right, you still have, you know, it's actually gotten worse as egalitarianism has risen. More women have gone into what we would call traditionally feminine fields, right? Teaching, nursing, social work, fields that are interested in people. And the proportion of men in the STEM fields has increased as well. So you've had actually fewer women going into the STEM fields as they've been given more choice and as kind of options have actually increased. And social attitudes about gender have become much more egalitarian. So there does, you know, potentially, I guess, a piece of evidence against the kind of feminist contention is there does seem to be certain sort of inborn traits in males and females that are a little bit different. And in particular, you know, on average, again, we're talking big, broad averages, males tend to be more interested in things, and females tend to be more interested in people and interpersonal relationships than men are. So we do tend to have, you know, kind of these big, broad patterns that maybe undermine that feminist kind of thinking a little bit. Okay. So I guess the kind of flipped coin of the feminist argument is a perspective, you know, like how do we come to gender roles that would be referred to as gender essentialism, right? And basically this says that, you know, gender is not, and gender roles are not socially constructed, that they're actually like deeply ingrained in biology. And it can be, from all sorts of different kind of perspectives. I've certainly seen evolutionary psychologists that take a very essentialist kind of reading of kind of gender roles. And, obviously, if you're talking very religiously conservative people, they're going to have a very religious perspective on it. So it can come from a bunch of different kind of perspectives. And like I said, I've seen, eminent evolutionary psychologists and evolutionary biologists that will espouse what essentially comes down to an essentialist role or point of view. And basically what essentialism posits is that, core characteristics of gender are tied deeply to biology, right? Particularly the brain, and particularly what happens to the brain and the body as a result of kind of hormones, right? So that testosterone has certain effects, right? It tends to make people more aggressive, more, seeking dominance, more competitive, and all of these sorts of things. Whereas estrogen and progesterone, right, the principal female hormones, tend to make people, more interpersonal, more agreeable. I guess like typically testosterone tends to make people less agreeable. Estrogen tends to make people more agreeable, reduce aggression, and all these sorts of things, right? This is kind of what's posited by a lot of people who are evolutionary psychologists or evolutionary biologists who take on this kind of role, right? So it would tend to, nature itself would tend to construct, females as more nurturing, more mothering, more social, more emotional, and males as more aggressive, competitive, stoic, and these sorts of things, right? So basically saying, right, those kind of traits that people tend to fall into on average are actually driven inherently by biology. And of course, there's biological differences between people, right? People have different muscle makeups, people have different levels of testosterone and estrogen naturally, and all of these kinds of differences in people can be ultimately explained by just biology, right? And that we tend to find, women clustering into certain fields and certain interests, and men clustering into different ones, ultimately as a result of biology. I think this was very much kind of the dominant view in society, really up until, I would say, the 1960s. And it's sort of been eroded more and more over time, right, as the feminist movement in particular has made inroads intellectually and kind of socially, kind of breaking down a lot of this and showing how a lot of things that we might tend to think of as natural actually have big social components to them. Okay, sorry, in terms of this essentialist view, there is a bunch of evidence that I do think backs this up, right? And again, I'm not making the case that it's 100% correct, but definitely there's not nothing to it, and you can see why some people come to this kind of belief based on the kind of information they're getting, right? There are, for example, if you look at kind of the big bell curves of kind of social attitudes and affinities, certain traits that more females have than males and vice versa, right? Amongst other things, right? And patterns in kind of gender are remarkably consistent, and they're even consistent relatively across cultures, right? So we don't see huge differences in a lot of cross-cultural studies. So things like, women tend to value interpersonal traits like honesty, politeness, forgiveness, empathy, and generosity more than men do. Women tend not to be as interested in sports and competition as men are. Again, on big averages. More concerned with questions of social justice and social issues, and tend to be more religious and have higher levels of spirituality than men have. So, these are, again, remarkably consistent across societies. We tend to see these pretty consistently held, which again, gives some backing to this kind of essentialist notion. Okay, maybe I'll do this last couple. How many slides do I have on this? I have one more slide. Well, let's do one more slide, and then we'll let you go for the day. So the blended view, I think it's much more intuitive in a sense that people tend to intuit into this view more than often have it as kind of a formal view. But the blended view, I don't really have a proper name for it. Like you wouldn't find a paper on the blended view of gender. But it's sort of one that you'll find in the literature, if you look at people who are practitioners, psychologists in particular, you'll tend to find this as a sort of view that predominates, even if we don't necessarily have a specific kind of movement or word for it. And the blended view basically, sees some gender traits as socially constructed, but some as biologically kind of ingrained. And, you know, I guess kind of anecdotally, I've started to see a lot more of this in kind of like post-feminist thinking. There's one particular person whose book I just read a few weeks ago called Louise Perry, and she's a British feminist, and she wrote a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, which is much less a case against the sexual revolution than the title tends to imply, but that's neither here nor there. Who I think would kind of come to this view as well, where basically it says, yeah, some things are socially constructed, right? Some kind of ways that we've thought about male and female roles, or, you know, things like dress, deportment, manners, are obviously kind of social artifacts, right? They're not consistent across cultures. You know, they tend to be kind of bound in space and time, right? And changeable if people decide to change them. But there also are some biological things. You know, we live in evolved bodies, bodies that have a kind of evolutionary heritage. And so there is also a biological component. And again, typically this is not meant to defend a traditional view of gender or gender roles, but often it's just like, look, if we're going to kind of, you know, help girls or boys thrive in general, we need to understand, you know, where the socially constructed piece ends and the biological piece begins in order to help them. I think like one of the, you know, there's definitely still constructed aspects of gender, but it's not everything. One of the, I think, most interesting practitioners of this is a guy named Leonard Sachs. He's a psychologist and pediatrician, right? So he has a double doctorate, which is freaking crazy. And basically, he kind of comes at it from a hands-on perspective and has written a lot on how, you know, in order to, say, help girls be more interested in things like physics and math, it helps to come at it with a different kind of cultural approach, right? To explain it in ways that are more interesting to them based on what they are more inclined to. It suggests, for example, that most explanations of like physics in physics 10 or 20 or whatever would start with like two cars collide or two football players collide on a sports field. Examples that may, you know, simply just not be that interesting, but may kind of excite one gender over another. And I'm sorry, I'm giving you a sketch view of kind of what he has to say. This book in particular, which is now, I think in its second edition, and he revised it just recently, and I haven't read the revised version, is really interesting for thinking through, you know, why gender differences might actually be important and why we might not want to downplay them. So I think he's a really interesting kind of thinker, and again, comes at it from a very practical perspective. Okay, I am now out of time. Thanks for being so patient, and thanks for the activity today. That was fun, and it was fun to see you kind of digging into you know, those generational differences a little bit. So we'll see you back here on Wednesday. We'll finish families, we'll do education, and I'll talk a little bit about the midterm, which is a week from Wednesday. So after the long weekend. All right, we'll see you on Wednesday. Hello.
Thank you.